Between 2007 and 2024, Florida took 500,000 tons of discarded oyster shells, scraped off restaurant plates and swept out of seafood processing plants, and dumped them into the Gulf of Mexico. Environmental groups called it reckless. Fishermen warned it would finish off what little marine life was left. Even the scientists running the program expected, at best, a slow disappointment. What actually happened on that seafloor didn't just prove them wrong, it happened faster than anyone thought biologically possible. This is the story of one of the most unlikely, most successful marine restoration projects on the American coastline, built entirely out of waste nobody wanted. Florida's Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission spent 17 years hauling recycled oyster and clam shells out to the Gulf near Cedar Key and simply dropping them onto the seafloor on the theory that even if the experiment failed completely, the shells were headed to a landfill anyway, so there was genuinely nothing to lose by trying. At the time the program began, Florida's Gulf Coast oyster populations had already been in serious decline for decades, hollowed out by a combination of overharvesting, coastal development, and pollution that had reduced historic populations by a dramatic margin across the wider Gulf region. Restoring that population wasn't simply a matter of protecting existing oysters from further harm. The underlying physical infrastructure those oysters depended on to reproduce, layers of accumulated shell forming a hard settlement surface, had itself been destroyed or buried, meaning even a fully protected, unharvested population would have had nowhere left to successfully reproduce. That specific problem, a missing physical substrate rather than simply too much fishing pressure, is what made the shell deposition strategy a genuinely targeted intervention rather than a vague, hopeful gesture. What grew there instead became one of the clearest real-world demonstrations of how quickly a dead patch of ocean floor can rebuild itself, once it's given the one thing it had been missing for decades. Let's start with how ordinary the material actually was, because that's exactly why so few people believed anything meaningful would come of it. The shells involved weren't manufactured, engineered, or specially treated. They were genuine restaurant and seafood processing waste, collected specifically because Florida's natural oyster reefs, hollowed out over decades by overharvesting, pollution, and coastal development, had lost the one thing oyster larvae actually need to survive: a hard surface to attach to. Oyster larvae, called spat, drift on ocean currents for a narrow window of time, searching for something solid to cement themselves to. Miss that window, land on soft sand instead, and they simply die. In a healthy reef system, that hard surface comes from the accumulated shells of previous generations, a self-perpetuating cycle stretching back centuries. Once Florida's natural reefs were destroyed, that cycle broke entirely, and Gulf larvae had nowhere left to land. When the state proposed dumping 500,000 tons of shell waste directly into the water to recreate that missing substrate, the backlash was immediate and, on its face, entirely reasonable. Environmental organizations characterized it as ocean dumping dressed up as conservation. Fishermen whose families had worked those waters for generations, worried about sediment smothering fragile remaining habitat and disrupting currents they depended on. This wasn't fringe opposition. It came from people with genuine, decades-deep knowledge of these specific waters. The Commission's reasoning was straightforward. The shells were being thrown away regardless, so testing them as reef substrate cost nothing beyond the logistics of moving them. In the worst case, waste simply relocated from a landfill to the seafloor. In the best case, the Gulf got back a hard surface it could no longer generate on its own. That opposition wasn't abstract or short-lived. Local charter captains, many representing multiple generations of family experience on these specific waters, testified against the program directly, arguing from decades of hands-on knowledge that dumping 500,000 tons of shell waste risked smothering whatever fragile life remained on the soft, sandy bottom. This was informed skepticism, not casual complaint. And it meant the program moved forward under real, sustained public scrutiny from exactly the people who stood to be most affected if it went wrong. Here's the part that genuinely surprised even the scientists running the project. Nobody expected results this fast. Conventional artificial reef efforts, using materials like concrete or sunken ships, typically take 2 to 3 years before showing meaningful biological activity. Monitoring teams, returning to the Cedar Key drop sites, found colonization happening in months rather than years, at a pace with no clear precedent in the existing research on artificial reef development. The explanation for that speed turned out to be happening at a scale too small to see with the naked eye. Within days of settling on the seafloor, bacteria began forming structured biofilms directly across the shell surfaces, converting dead calcium carbonate into functioning microhabitats almost immediately. But the shells were doing something more active than simply providing a surface. Oyster shells are made largely of aragonite, a form of calcium carbonate that slowly dissolves in seawater, and as that dissolution released calcium ions, it created small alkaline pockets in the surrounding water. precisely the chemical conditions that barnacles, tube worms, and young oysters need in order to successfully attach and grow. The material wasn't just passive structure, it was actively altering the surrounding water chemistry in a way that invited colonization, something an ordinary slab of concrete or sunken hull simply doesn't do. That distinction is worth dwelling on, because it explains why this specific approach outperformed decades of more conventional artificial reef construction. A sunken ship or concrete structure gives marine organisms somewhere to sit, but it does nothing to change the surrounding water chemistry, meaning colonization still has to happen at whatever pace ambient conditions allow. The shell deposits were doing two things simultaneously, offering physical structure while also actively generating the specific chemical microenvironment that calcifying organisms needed to succeed, and that combination appears to be exactly what allowed colonization to compress from years down to months. From there, the sequence built on itself. Diatoms and microalgae moved into the bacterial biofilms within weeks, establishing a basic food web. Small crustaceans and larval mollusks followed, drawing in the first juvenile fish. Each stage created the specific conditions the next stage needed, a self-reinforcing ecological chain assembling itself with no further human involvement, on material that had, only months earlier, been restaurant garbage. A plain, sandy seafloor cannot support this kind of layered progression at all, not because life doesn't want to establish itself there, but because sand offers nothing to attach to and no chemical microzones to draw colonizing organisms in. The shells sidestepped that limitation entirely, supplying the one missing structural and chemical ingredient the system needed, and then stepping back while natural biological succession did the rest. Once the substrate problem was solved, the oyster reproductive cycle itself took over. Juvenile oysters began settling on the shells in their first year, reaching reproductive maturity by the second, releasing their own larvae to settle on the growing structure and add a second generation of shell on top of the first. This is the point at which researchers involved described the project shifting from a human intervention into a self-sustaining natural process. State agencies had chosen the drop sites and provided the initial substrate, but from there, the oysters did the actual rebuilding entirely on their own, generation stacking on generation with no further material added. The recovery wasn't limited to oysters. Once structural complexity appeared on a previously featureless, sandy seafloor, reef fish species moved in to exploit it, since bare sand offers no shelter, no ambush points, and no feeding surface, while a developing reef offers all three at once. Researchers monitoring the sites reported substantial increases in both fish biomass and species diversity compared to nearby control areas without reef structure, and were specifically able to confirm that juvenile fish were surviving to maturity in habitat that hadn't previously supported them. Rather than simply documenting existing fish relocating toward a new landmark, a critical distinction that separates genuine ecological production from the kind of fish aggregation effect seen at many conventional artificial reefs built from concrete or sunken vessels. That distinction deserves real emphasis because it's the difference between an impressive-looking survey result and an actual ecological recovery. Sink a wrecked ship or a pile of concrete rubble onto a bare seafloor, and fish from the surrounding area will often gather around it almost immediately, drawn to the first available structure in an otherwise featureless environment. A survey of that site will show plenty of fish, and on the surface that can look like a resounding success, but it isn't necessarily creating any new fish at all. The Cedar Key data specifically supported the more meaningful outcome. Young fish, spawned in or near these waters, were surviving to adulthood in numbers. The surrounding open sand could never have supported, meaning the reefs were functioning as genuine nurseries rather than simply furniture for fish that already existed elsewhere. Different species appeared to settle into distinct ecological niches as the reef complexity increased. Larger predatory fish used the tangled shell structure to ambush prey and evade larger threats of their own, while smaller species fed directly on the invertebrate communities coating the hard surfaces, and others worked the boundary where reef structure met open sand, exploiting that specific transitional zone. Each niche that filled in made the overall system incrementally richer, denser, and more resistant to any single disruption, the hallmark of a genuinely maturing ecosystem rather than a simple collection of structure and fish. Beyond fish, researchers documented a broader cascade of species returning to these waters over the following years. Octopuses claiming territory within the reefs, crevices, and overhangs, sea turtles foraging on the invertebrate communities coating the structure, and dolphins working the dense fish concentrations along the reef edges the way a predator exploits any dependable food source. Each new arrival reinforced the food web beneath it, adding another layer of complexity to a system that had started only a few years earlier as loose piles of discarded restaurant shells sitting on otherwise bare sand. There's also a filtration effect worth understanding on its own terms. A single adult oyster filters somewhere in the range of 30 to 50 gallons of seawater daily, and scaled up across hundreds of thousands of oysters colonizing these restored reefs. That filtration capacity becomes genuinely significant, continuously removing suspended particles, excess nutrients, and pollutants from Gulf water without requiring any machinery, electricity, or maintenance cost. Given the Gulf Coast's chronic nutrient runoff problem, agricultural nitrogen and phosphorus feeding the harmful algal blooms that periodically devastate coastal ecosystems, oyster filtration attacks that problem directly at its source. Building an engineered water treatment facility capable of matching that filtration volume and maintaining it continuously year after year would represent an enormous ongoing infrastructure cost. The oyster reefs perform the equivalent function without any comparable investment, and, unlike mechanical infrastructure, their filtration capacity actually increases over time as the reef continues expanding and hosting more oysters, rather than degrading the way a treatment plant's equipment eventually would. Researchers reported measurable improvements in water clarity and dissolved oxygen levels around the reef sites, improvements that extended outward into surrounding waters rather than staying confined to the reef itself, in turn allowing more sunlight to reach the seafloor and supporting the return of seagrass beds in areas that had previously been too murky to sustain them. That seagrass recovery created its own secondary feedback loop worth understanding, because it illustrates how a single successful intervention can cascade outward into effects well beyond its original scope. Seagrass beds stabilize loose sediment on the seafloor, which reduces water turbidity further, which allows even more sunlight to penetrate, which in turn supports additional seagrass growth, a self-reinforcing cycle triggered indirectly by the original oyster filtration effect. Seagrass itself provides critical habitat for juvenile fish, manatees, and sea turtles, meaning the benefits of the original shell deposits ultimately extended into supporting an entirely different category of marine life that had no direct connection to the oyster reefs themselves, simply because clearer water made their preferred habitat viable again in areas where it had previously disappeared. Then, in September 2017, Hurricane Irma provided an entirely unplanned but genuinely significant test of the reef's structural value. Assessors examining coastal damage after the storm found that shorelines protected by the restored oyster reefs experienced substantially less erosion than unprotected stretches of coast nearby, with the reefs functioning as natural wave attenuators, their dense, irregular three-dimensional structure absorbing and scattering wave energy in a way a smooth, engineered seawall cannot replicate. The physics behind that difference is straightforward once you understand it. A wave rolling toward a smooth, hard surface, like a concrete seawall, retains most of its momentum right up until the moment of impact, meaning the full force of the wave transfers directly into the structure and whatever lies behind it. A wave encountering a reef's jagged, porous, three-dimensional surface instead loses energy progressively, broken apart by friction and by the countless small gaps, overhangs, and irregular edges the reef presents along its length. That inversion, infrastructure that improves through use rather than degrading, represents a genuinely different model for coastal protection than anything traditional engineering typically offers, and it's a large part of why coastal engineers outside Florida have taken the Cedar Key results so seriously. The broader model has since spread well beyond Florida. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas have launched their own oyster shell recycling and reef restoration programs, and New York Harbor's Billion Oyster Project applied the same underlying principle in one of the most heavily polluted urban waterways in North America, demonstrating the approach isn't limited to warm, shallow Gulf conditions. Coastal engineers in Canada, Australia, and Europe have since studied the Florida model directly, examining whether nature-based restoration using recycled shell material can outperform traditional concrete and steel coastal engineering in comparable degraded environments elsewhere in the world. By the early 2020s, the oldest Cedar Key reef sites had reportedly expanded well beyond their original footprint, continuing to grow with no additional shell ever added after the initial deposits. The underlying mechanism is simply the oyster reproductive cycle operating at scale. Each generation settles onto existing structure, matures, eventually dies, and leaves its shell behind as substrate for the next wave of larvae, building vertically and spreading horizontally in a way that mirrors how a forest naturally expands outward once the first trees take root. The structural complexity of the mature reefs also increased substantially compared to the original loose mounds of shell, developing distinct vertical profiles, overhangs, and interlocking gaps that created dozens of separate microhabitats, allowing crabs, octopuses, sea stars, and juvenile fish to each exploit different physical features of the same structure simultaneously. Researchers have also pointed to a carbon storage benefit that wasn't part of the original justification for the project at all. Dense oyster reef structures lock organic carbon into their shells, and the surrounding sediment, effectively trapping material that might otherwise contribute to ocean acidification and atmospheric warming, a side effect significant enough that oyster restoration has since begun appearing in broader climate adaptation discussions, alongside its more established role in habitat recovery and coastal defense. So here's where the honest picture of this project actually lands. What began in 2007 as a genuinely uncertain experiment built from material nobody valued, opposed by people with real, legitimate expertise in these specific waters, turned into one of the clearest demonstrations available of how quickly a damaged marine ecosystem can rebuild itself once its single missing structural component is restored. The distinction researchers have been careful to draw between fish aggregation, simply gathering existing marine life around a new structure, and genuine fish production, creating survival conditions that didn't previously exist, is exactly what separates this project from many earlier artificial reef efforts. And it's the detail that ultimately convinced skeptical local fishermen, including vocal early opponents of the program, that something genuinely different had happened in these specific waters. None of this required inventing new technology or importing expensive engineered material. It required identifying the specific missing piece, a hard substrate for oyster larvae to colonize, supplying it using material that was otherwise headed for a landfill, and then allowing a well-understood, centuries-old biological cycle to do the rest of the work entirely on its own. Researchers studying the project have started using a specific term to describe this broader approach: circular environmental design, the idea that materials previously written off as waste, oyster shells, coral fragments, limestone rubble, can be deliberately repurposed as functional ecological infrastructure rather than simply discarded, not as a stopgap measure, but as a genuine replicable design strategy with measurable, quantifiable ecological and economic returns. That framing matters because it reframes the entire project's significance. This wasn't simply a successful one-off restoration effort specific to one stretch of Florida coastline. It became a working proof of concept for an entirely different philosophy of coastal management, one where biological processes that have been shaping coastlines for millions of years are allowed to do the structural work that engineers have traditionally tried to replace with concrete and steel. The traditional approach, hard armoring using seawalls and riprap, is costly to install, requires constant maintenance, and frequently fails under exactly the extreme storm conditions it was designed to withstand. The oyster reef model offers a fundamentally different value proposition: lower initial cost, no ongoing maintenance expense, and a structure that becomes more effective with age rather than less, all built from material that would otherwise have been thrown away entirely. What's left today is a stretch of Gulf Coast where reefs that began as loose piles of restaurant waste have continued expanding well beyond their original footprint, still growing, still filtering water, and still providing measurable storm protection nearly 2 decades after the first shells were dropped, all without requiring any additional investment beyond the original program. The oldest sites have reportedly doubled in total area since their initial deposit, with no additional shell added at any point after the program's original drop dates, expanding purely through the ongoing reproductive cycle of the oyster populations that established themselves there. That trajectory points towards something restoration science rarely gets to claim with real confidence: a genuinely self-sustaining system that no longer requires human management to continue functioning. The 500,000 tons of shell material deposited between 2007 and 2024 appear to have seeded a cycle that is now perpetuating itself indefinitely. One where each generation of oysters that lives and dies adds substrate for the next. Each incremental expansion creates new habitat, and every additional habitat filters more water and shelters more species, with each part of the cycle reinforcing every other part in a loop that shows no obvious sign of needing further intervention to continue. So we want to ask you directly: if 500,000 tons of something nobody wanted could rebuild an entire coastal ecosystem this quickly and continue improving on its own for decades afterward, what other categories of waste do you think might be sitting on a similar, unrecognized second use, waiting for someone willing to try something everyone else assumed was reckless? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. We read every one of them. If this is the kind of story you want more of, the kind where the real discovery is watching nature take a pile of garbage and quietly turn it into something alive, self-sustaining, and still growing today, make sure you're subscribed, because next time we're heading somewhere just as remarkable. Until then, stay curious and keep questioning the version of history you were handed.